I recently read a survey that indicated that 73% of those respondents here in America felt that the world around us is in moral decline. And I wasn't surprised by this because this is something that I have often been feeling myself. But what I was surprised by is that nearly 3 out of every 4 people asked in this survey felt the same way. And I think this begs the question, if so many people around us feel that the world is in moral decline, how come it's happening? What's going on in the first place? And I have a theory on this, as you may have guessed. Oftentimes, we first see the symptoms of an illness before we go explore what's behind the illness. Right? First, we get the temperature and the cough and the sneezing, and then finally we go to the doctor to figure out what may be causing those things. So perhaps this is something that is a positive for us because many people around us feel that things in the world are on a moral decline, and now that we're recognizing it, perhaps we'd be willing to go take a look at what's causing it. What's the sickness that underlies it all? Every time I do a Faith Foundations class or a First Communion class, I tell the story about how in his early years when he became the host of The Tonight Show, Jay Leno thought it would be very funny if he went around the streets of Los Angeles, Hollywood, and he asked people on camera to name the 10 Commandments. And he turned out to be brilliant. He was absolutely right. It was quite comedic because very few of the answers were the 10 Commandments. So as a little bit of a fun and games thing I do every time I have classes, I see if we as a class can go around the room and come up with all 10 commandments. And after doing this for many, many years, what I can tell you from my observations is I would say that probably less than half of the people who go to church can name all 10 commandments off the top of their head. And I'm firmly convinced that a lot of the moral decline that surrounds us in the world has to do with this fact. That perhaps maybe we don't know the basic things that God has laid down for us. Lent, this time we enter in today with Ash Wednesday, is this blessed gift given to us by God to really figure out what we treasure and what's important for us in our lives. The word Lent comes from the Old English word for spring. And I love this because it immediately makes a connection for us. The idea behind Lent is that it's intended to be a gift from God where we do some spiritual soul cleaning. We do some spring cleaning for our soul. I mean, that's after all what we happen and what we do every time we enter into spring, right? We get ready for the growth that's yet to come. And that same motivation lies at the heart of the season of Lent that we enter into, leading us to the joy of Easter and the comfort that we have. And most of us today came forward to begin this season of Lent by marking our heads with this dusty ashen cross. And that's an indication that we recognize that the sickness, the sin is in us also. That we're part of the reason for the moral decline that surrounds us in the world. And yet this season of Lent, especially today, Ash Wednesday, that starts us on this journey, is intended to be this precious treasure that reconnects us more deeply with God. Listen to the words of invitation that we hear in our readings today. First, the prophet Joel begged of us a song that we'll sing throughout the season of Lent. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Then King David, after the worst sins that he could possibly commit in his life, murder and adultery, he sings the beautiful song of our psalm. That's our offertory song during this time of year. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Paul, talking to the church at Corinth, in the time after Jesus' Corinth, this church, it was constantly infighting, constantly getting the wrong answer. He begs of them, be reconciled to God. And Jesus himself, as he continues in the Sermon on the Mount, we spent a lot of time over the last few weeks in the Sermon on the Mount, but this reading for Ash Wednesday brings us some very important words where Jesus says to us, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but treasures in heaven, where moth and rust cannot destroy. moth and rust cannot destroy. Those are the treasures of Lent. That's what this journey is all about. And as Jesus talks about treasures in the gospel lesson, what he's really getting at is the first commandment of the 10. The first commandment given by God through Moses is, "You shall have no other gods before me." Now, we all know by now that this year is the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation, of what began our identity as Lutheran Christians. And in the time after the putting up of the theses that started this 500 years ago, Martin Luther put together what was called the Small Catechism. It was supposed to be a short manual, a handbook on basic Christianity. And it starts basically with the 10 Commandments. And not only does he lay out the 10 Commandments so that people know what they can expect from God and what they should be doing, but he also goes on to give meaning to or explain what each of those commandments mean. And so what he wrote about the first commandment is this: we are to fear, love, and trust in God above all things. I think at the heart of the moral decline that surrounds us in life today is that that's been forgotten. Everything else has been put before God. We have a broken political system where we raise up leaders who themselves want to be a god, worshipped and adored. We're surrounded by an entertainment industry that used to be for us an escape from the reality and the struggles and the pressures of the world, but now it seeks to reign over us, telling us what to believe and how to think and how to live our lives. We have a public education system that's worked hard not only to have the separation of church and state or spiritual things and worldly things, but it's gone even further just to eradicate any acknowledgement of an existence of a creator or a God who is over us and holds us accountable. And even the church herself, as it oftentimes allowed the wrong actions and the wrong words of human beings to overshadow the message and the blessings that God gives to us. We are to fear, love, and trust in God above all things. That word fear isn't the cowering in the corner fear that we're going to be beaten by somebody. It's a word that connotes awe, reverence, respect. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that we do have a creator who designed us, molded us, and made us, and is the source of our lives. And understanding that, we have one to look up to. Love. It's not that God is calling us to love him and not everything else, but it's recognizing that all those things that we love in our lives come from the love of the God who created us with a value and a purpose. And once you see that, it's much easier to love the things over here. And trusting in God above all things. Probably the hardest challenge before any of us, because what it means is setting aside our worries, our anxieties, and our fears. And even when life is uncertain, trusting that God sees the big picture, that God has a plan for us. Many years ago, there was a funeral in the Midwest for this wife of a man who became incredibly affluent during the time when the highway system was being built across the United States. So the family had a lot of money. So as the funeral was progressing and as they went to the graveside and finally as they were walking away from the graveside, it could be heard as a conversation among many people about how much money do you think this family has? How much money do you think she had when she died? And this went back and forth for a while, and finally someone said, so how much money do you think she's leaving behind? And finally another person overhearing it said, all of it. That's the reality of the situation. The treasure that Jesus calls us to build when he talks about do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but treasures in heaven, comes from recognizing the reality of our lives. That sin is a real sickness, and it leads to death. And this life, for as much as we like it and love it, isn't the life that our Creator intended for us. And that's why the necessity of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is so real. And that's why the hope and the joy of the Easter resurrection is at the heart and center of who we are as God's people. Because recognizing that then shows us the things that we should treasure most. During the season of Lent, especially on these Wednesdays, we're going to take the opportunity to look at, again, the Ten Commandments. To look at the Ten Commandments as a treasure and a gift from God. That they are a gift because God understands who we are because he created us. And when he laid down these commandments for us, it was in the hopes that our lives would be as healthy and as happy as they could possibly be. So I invite you during this journey of Lent, especially on these Wednesdays, to help set aside the moral decay that surrounds us and come find the treasures that God gives to us over and over again. Amen.